In 2023, a crew hauled live fish into the Taklamakan Desert, a place known for centuries as the Sea of Death. The ground beneath them held water too salty for crops, too alkaline for anything familiar. They pumped it up anyway, blended it with snowmelt, and released the fish into membrane-lined desert ponds. 12 months later, those ponds were producing commercial seafood. The result came back and said 99 out of every 100 fish had survived. The desert had not killed them, it had fed them. The men who hauled those fish into the desert that night drove back in silence because they had no idea whether what they had just done would be remembered as an engineering triumph or an expensive catastrophe. The ponds behind them were lined with impermeable membranes, bubbling with water pulled from deep below the sand. Water that had sat untouched in those aquifers for longer than anyone had been keeping records. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch, and this is the story of how engineers turned the most hostile desert in Asia into a working seafood farm, built over 3 decades of failure, tested against a flood that nearly ended it, and still holding one question nobody has answered. To understand why that survival rate stunned everyone who read it, you have to start with what the Taklamakan actually is, and what it had defeated every single time before that first crew arrived. The Taklamakan sits inside Xinjiang, in the deep interior of China, and in summer, its surface reaches 50 degrees Celsius. Below that surface lies something the desert kept hidden for centuries. A vast reserve of saline groundwater, alkaline and mineral heavy, chemically close to the sea, but saturated with salts that kill every conventional crop it touches. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, regional authorities tried to force traditional agriculture onto those soils anyway, planting into ground that evaporated moisture faster than roots could chase it, and watching the harvests fail season after season. Then, in 2018, agronomists planted salt-tolerant sea rice into groundwater that was marginally less saline and got yields thin enough to prove one thing. Some cultivation here was physically possible, but not economically worth it. And this is where the thinking broke open, because the engineers who looked at that saline groundwater stopped seeing a problem and started seeing raw material. They pumped the groundwater up, blended it with snowmelt running off the Kunlun Mountains, and added precise concentrations of calcium, magnesium, and potassium ions, until the chemistry inside those membrane-lined ponds matched the open ocean. What the ponds looked like from outside was a row of greenhouses in the sand, ordinary enough that a driver passing on the highway might not slow down. What was living inside them? Rainbow trout turning hard against artificial currents, mitten crabs moving across mesh, shrimp clustering in water held at a steady 20 to 30 degrees, while the air outside plunged from 50 degrees to near freezing in a single day, was something the desert had never held before in its entire history. The flood at Hotan. That 99% survival rate was not the end of the experiment. It was the starting gun for something far larger and far more expensive. In June 2024, technicians at a farm in Kimo County unloaded 100,000 marine fry brought in from the coast, lowering them 1 tank at a time into formulated saline groundwater. The first commercial-scale move the project had ever attempted. Wang Hui, who ran the aquatic farming base in Tolganj village, put the ambition plainly: 67 hectares of saline alkali desert land converted into working ponds, raising Chinese mitten crab, white-leg shrimp, Australian freshwater lobster and common perch, mainly, in his words, to supply local markets. Consider the scale the region reached around those hectares. 184,000 tons of aquatic products, recorded in 2023 climbing to 196,500 tons by 2024, generated across a region that just years earlier could not grow grain. Total revenues crossing $530 million. A pH that engineers pulled down from extreme alkalinity to a stable band between 7.5 and 8.5, and lobsters pulled from desert ponds, each weighing 130 grams, fat and intact. The structure, holding all of it together, was the membrane, a continuous impermeable liner pressed against the sand beneath every pond, the single physical barrier between a working fishery and the desert floor that would swallow the water in hours if it failed. The water inside those membranes did something a thermometer on the outside wall would call impossible. Automated sensors and continuous biological filtration held it at a steady 20 to 30 degrees Celsius, while the desert air overhead swung 50 degrees in a single day. The tanks, running like a climate inside a climate, sealed off from everything surrounding them. And this is where the plan broke. Because in Hotan, following heavy rainfall, a flash flood tore through the aquaculture zone without warning. More than 600,000 fish were swept out in a matter of hours, tens of millions of yuan gone, the losses landing on investors who had committed real capital on the assumption that the desert's worst enemy was its soil, not its sky. But the flood, costly as it was, did not invalidate what the biology had already proven. It identified the one variable the engineers had underweighted, and the farms that survived it were rebuilt with that reckoning built in. Inside a surviving greenhouse in Tolganj village, farm workers reached into the water and manually lifted submerged mesh shelters. And what crawled across the surface were Australian freshwater lobsters and Chinese mitten crabs, alive, marketable, grown in a place that geographically has no business producing either. What nobody has yet settled is whether the aquifers feeding all of it can absorb this permanently, whether decades of pumping will quietly lower the water table beneath the desert before anyone has measured how deep the margin actually is. Seafood without a coast. The crabs and lobsters were alive, but getting them to a me buyer was a problem nobody had fully solved when the first tanks went in. Air freighting seafood from the Chinese coast had always meant the fish arrived expensive and hours removed from the water, and inland Xinjiang was the last stop on a very long cold chain. What the desert farms changed was that distance. A crab pulled from a Tolganj pond at dawn could reach a Hotan market before noon, still moving. And this is where the project became something larger than a fish farm, because feeding local markets meant the desert itself was now undercutting the coast. The species doing that quiet economic work looked nothing alike. Rainbow trout muscling through high current channels, white-leg shrimp hovering in mid-column, snakehead fish holding still near the bottom, like something carved from shadow. Each species put its own demands on that water, and the engineers held it inside each one's tolerances, watching ion concentrations the way a pharmacist watches a compound, one element at a time. The trout presented the hardest case. It drives its torpedo-shaped body against the artificial current constantly, hour after hour, using that resistance to build the dense muscle that makes it worth selling. And the current has to be strong enough to matter, without stressing the animal past the point it can recover. Getting that balance right is like tuning a treadmill for an athlete you cannot talk to. The fish tells you it is wrong only after the damage is done. Pearl oysters added a dimension of their own. An oyster filters the water it lives in, pulling suspended particles through its body, cleaning the tank as it feeds. So the species ended up working for each other. Oysters doing biological work that would otherwise fall to machinery, crabs grazing organic waste off the bottom, shrimp cycling nutrients the fish left behind. But the engineers went one step further, because the water draining out of those tanks, warm and thick with biological material, still had work left to do. That effluent moved directly into adjacent greenhouses, irrigating sea rice and vegetables with what had just been fish water, And nobody has yet counted how many farms across the region are running that same closed loop, or how far it could go. A predator in the tanks. What that closed loop changed, quietly, was the economics of the entire operation. A farm, paying almost nothing for fertilizer or irrigation water, is running on margins a coastal fish farm cannot match. But the snakehead fish demanded something none of the others did. It hunts, and in a closed tank, it hunts the walls, testing them, holding motionless near the bottom, then striking upward at the surface with a burst of speed that looks violent even through glass. Managing a predator inside a shared system meant keeping its density low enough that it did not turn on neighbouring stock. One more variable the sensors tracked, one more threshold to hold. And this is where the question the project has not answered grows sharpest. Because every species, every greenhouse row, every tank of trout runs on groundwater pulled from aquifers that formed over timescales nobody measured. Aquifers that have never been proven able to keep pace with what is being drawn from them now. Ecological experts warn that prolonged drought could cause the whole structure to falter, not with a flood this time, but with a slow and invisible drop in the water table, felt first in falling tank levels, then in chemistry that drifts past the tolerances the fish can survive. The membrane that keeps the water in the tank cannot keep anything out of the aquifer below it, and increased soil salinization from evaporation at the surface is a cost that accumulates in the ground long before it shows up in a balance sheet. What engineers built in the Taklamakan is a system that works genuinely measurably on a commercial scale, sitting above an open question that the ground itself will eventually answer on its own schedule and not theirs. The fact is this: a desert that defeated every conventional attempt at cultivation for 3 decades is now producing seafood, vegetables and rice from the same installation, running on water that was always there, waiting for a different question. And the map of places holding that same kind of water does not stop in China. The American Southwest sits on the same curse: alkaline ground, saline aquifers, farm towns watching the Colorado shrink and the Ogallala drop. The exact conditions the Taklamakan just turned into a fishery. Nothing in the biology says the idea cannot travel. So 2 futures sit at the end of this story. In one, the aquifers hold, and the Sea of Death becomes the working model for every saline basin on Earth. In the other, the water table drops faster than anyone measured, and the desert takes back what it briefly gave. What the story means is simpler than the engineering. The thing that was killing the land turned out to be the thing that made it work, once someone stopped fighting it. Tonight, in a greenhouse outside Tolgunj, a rainbow trout is driving its body into the current. Olive back, that pink stripe catching the grow lights, fins working steadily against water that has no business being there. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch. If you're drawn to the stories of places the world wrote off, and the stubborn, costly, occasionally flooding attempts to prove it wrong, stay right here because the next one begins now.